The morning Georgia Dawson walked into the Hays City Land Office. The Kansas sky was the color of a bruise healing at its edges, purple fading into yellow, and she carried nothing with her but a folded deed, a worn leather satchel, and hands so cracked from 3 years of drought-split soil and lye soap that the cold October air of 1873 found every fissure like a cruel friend. She was 31 years old, and she had buried her husband in August, and she had not cried since the funeral because there was simply no time for it. That was the truth of the frontier that nobody wrote home about. Grief was a luxury you could not afford when the cattle still needed tending, and the well needed drawing, and the 2 children still needed feeding, and the bank in Hays City had sent a letter with very polite handwriting that meant very impolite things about what would happen if she missed another payment on the land note. So Georgia Dawson did not cry. She woke before light and worked until she could no longer see her hands in front of her face, and then she slept 4 or 5 hours and woke and did it again. She had done this for 3 months straight, through the final weeks of summer and all of September and now into October, and the result was that her hands were cracked and her shoulders ached and her eyes were the clearest, most direct eyes in all of Ellis County because there was no fog left in her. The pretense had burned away. What remained was just Georgia, exact and unvarnished and quietly formidable in a way that she herself had not yet recognized. The land office sat on the main street of Hays City between a dry goods store and a barber shop. The sign above the door had been painted by someone who was better at their job than most signs in Kansas gave you reason to hope for. Georgia pushed the door open, and a little bell rang above her head, and the smell of coal dust and paper and ink rose up to meet her. The office was narrow and long. There was a counter running most of its length, and behind the counter were shelves stacked with survey maps and deed books and ledgers, organized with a precision that suggested the man responsible for them cared about his work, more than the average person cared about most things. There were 2 chairs against the wall for waiting, both empty, and a cast iron stove in the corner that was doing its job earnestly. Jonas Rourke was on his hands and knees behind the counter when she walked in, which was not the most authoritative introduction, but the reason for it was practical enough. He had dropped a brass inkwell somewhere in the gap between the lower shelf and the floorboards, and he had heard it roll, and he was trying to recover it before it tipped and turned 3 years of survey records into an abstract painting. He had one hand jammed behind a ledger box and one cheek pressed sideways to see under the shelf, and he looked exactly like what he was, which was a 34-year-old man who had given up any pretense of dignity in pursuit of a very small practical problem. Georgia stood at the counter and said, "Take your time." Her voice was not unkind. It was simply direct. It sounded like someone who had stopped performing patience and had arrived at the real thing, which is quieter and more useful. Jonas Rourke extracted himself from the floor with the inkwell recovered and his dignity approximately intact. He stood up, brushed the knee of his trousers, and looked at her. He was a tall man, not exceptional in that way, but enough that the office seemed to have been built with him specifically in mind. His hair was dark and cut close on the sides and somewhat unruly on top in a way that suggested he had cut it himself or had it cut by someone who charged very little. His jaw was clean-shaved. His eyes were a quiet, serious gray that had the same quality as George's clear ones, the quality of having looked at real things for long enough that they were no longer impressed by surfaces. He set the inkwell on the counter. "Good morning," he said. "What can I do for you?" "Georgia Dawson," she said by way of introduction, and placed the folded deed on the counter between them. "My husband was Robert Dawson. He passed in August. I need to have the land transferred into my name, and I need to understand what exactly my situation is with the note." Jonas looked at the deed without picking it up yet. He looked at her hands for just a moment, not rudely, but the way a man looks at hands when hands tell him something. He looked back at her face. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and he meant it in a way that the phrase is not always meant. "Thank you," Georgia said. Now can you tell me about the note?" He almost smiled at that, not because it was funny but because it was honest. He pulled the deed toward him and opened it and read the details, then turned to the shelves behind him and ran one finger along a row of ledger books until he found the right one. He lifted it down and set it on the counter and opened it with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly where every entry was. "Dawson," he said, finding the line. He read it for a moment. "You're 3 months behind on the note payment. The original amount was $420. You've paid $215. The remaining balance with interest is $262. Georgia had already known this. She had done the arithmetic herself at the kitchen table by lamplight enough times to have the numbers memorized, but hearing it said out loud by another person, in an official setting, made it feel different in a way she had not entirely anticipated. It felt more solid, more real. "What is the timeline before the bank moves to foreclose?" she asked. Jonas looked at the ledger again. "The note is held through First Territorial Bank. They're required to give 60 days notice before initiating foreclosure proceedings. You received the first notice in September, which means you have until approximately the second week of November." He paused. "That is not much time." "No," Georgia agreed. "It is not." She was quiet for a moment. Jonas did not fill the silence with false comfort, which she appreciated. He waited with his hands resting on the ledger and let her think. "I have cattle," she said, 11 head. If I sell them at current prices, I can cover most of the remaining balance, but I'd have no breeding stock for next spring and no way to rebuild the herd." "How many acres?" Jonas asked. 320. Eastern section is fair grazing land. West section is better, closer to the creek. The homestead is on the north end." Jonas made a small sound that was not quite a word and turned to a different shelf. He pulled down a survey map and unfolded it on the counter between them carefully, because old survey maps in Kansas in 1873 were not infinitely patient with rough handling. He found the Dawson section and put his finger on it. "You're adjacent here to the Callaway parcel," he said, "which is currently unclaimed. If you filed to extend your claim under the Homestead Act provisions, you could add another 160 acres to the west without additional cost beyond the filing fee. More land along the creek would increase your property value considerably. It would also give you more collateral if you went and negotiate the note terms directly with the bank." Georgia looked at the map. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, directly and carefully without hurrying. "I did not know that parcel was unclaimed," she said. "Most people don't. The previous claimant abandoned it in '71. It's been sitting in the records here ever since." "How much is the filing fee?" $14. Georgia looked up from the map and at Jonas. "You're trying to help me," she said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. It was an observation with a question underneath it. Jonas met her eyes without flinching. "That's what this office is supposed to do," he said. "Most people who come in here don't know what options they have. Part of my job is making sure they know." There was something in the way he said it that was very quiet and very firm, the way certain principles sound when they've been practiced long enough to become simply true. Georgia studied him for another moment. He studied her back without being intrusive about it. "All right," she said. "Show me how to file for the extension." That was how it started, not with a glance across a crowded room or a dramatic meeting on horseback under an open sky. It started over a survey map in a narrow land office on a Tuesday morning in October, with two practical people solving a practical problem. And the thing neither of them recognized yet was that something had moved in the room that had nothing to do with deeds or notes or parcel numbers. Jonas pulled the appropriate form from a drawer and set it on the counter and explained each line as she filled it in. He had a way of explaining things that was thorough without being condescending, which Georgia found so unusual that she almost commented on it. He assumed she understood things until she showed him otherwise, which was the right assumption to make about Georgia Dawson. When the form was complete, she counted $14 from her satchel in careful coins and bills, and he wrote her a receipt and stamped the form and recorded the filing in the ledger. It will take 2 to 3 weeks to process, he said. You'll receive written confirmation. And the bank, she asked. I'd recommend going to them directly. With the extended claim in process, you have a stronger position. You could argue the increased land value against the note terms. Ask to restructure the payment schedule. He hesitated for just half a second. I can write you a letter on land office letterhead explaining the claim and the estimated value increase if you think that would help. Georgia looked at him. Would you do that? It's not outside what this office does, he said, and there was that quiet firmness again. She said, then yes, I would appreciate that. He wrote the letter while she waited at the small desk behind the counter, and his handwriting was neat and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who thought carefully before he put things down. She watched the top of his head while he wrote and thought about the fact that she had not asked a single person for help since Robert died, and that she had walked in here this morning with the full intention of not asking for help now either, and that she was somehow leaving with more than she had come for. Not just the land extension, though that was real and substantial. Something else. The particular feeling of being seen by someone who was paying attention. She did not name that feeling to herself. She picked up the letter and thanked him and left. On her way out, the bell rang again over the door, and Jonas Rourke stood at the counter for a moment after she'd gone, and looked at the door with his hands flat on the counter, and his face doing something complicated that he didn't have an immediate name for either. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest of Georgia's life, and that was saying something because her life had contained considerable hardness. She drove the 11 head of cattle to market in Hayes City on a Friday morning with her son Thomas, who was 12 and old enough to help but still young enough that she watched him carefully around the animals. She got a fair price for 7 of the cattle and kept 4 back, the 2 breeding cows and 2 young steers she thought she could sell in spring for a better return. She went to the bank with Jonas's letter in her satchel and sat across the desk from a banker named Harold Fitch, who had the soft hands and flat eyes of a man who had made many people uncomfortable at this very desk over many years. Harold Fitch read Jonas's letter twice. Then he looked at Georgia over the top of his reading glasses in the way that men who are accustomed to making decisions for women looked at Georgia, which was with a particular combination of dismissal and assessment that she had learned to receive without expression. You're still short on the note, he said. By $62, Georgia said, which I will have by the second week of November. The land extension is in process, and my collateral position is substantially improved as the letter explains. The bank's position is that you will receive your money, Georgia said, in full. All I am asking is 60 additional days on the payment schedule, which costs you nothing and preserves a productive farm operation rather than forcing a foreclosure that would take months to resolve and cost the bank in legal fees and administrative time. Harold Fitch looked at her for a moment as though he was recalibrating something. She looked back at him with those clear eyes and said nothing more because she had said everything that needed saying. He restructured the note. She walked out of the bank into the October wind with the restructured agreement in her satchel and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt something she hadn't felt in months, which was a kind of forward momentum. Not happiness exactly, something more basic and more durable, the sense that she might actually be all right. She went back to the land office. She told herself it was to check on the progress of the filing, which was true, but it was also not the whole truth, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. Jonas was at the counter when she came in, working through a stack of papers that he was annotating in his neat hand. He looked up when the bell rang, and when he saw it was her, something in his expression did a small quiet thing that might have been pleasure, quickly composed. "Mrs. Dawson," he said. "The bank agreed to restructure," she said, and she was smiling, and she had not smiled properly in months, and it looked like something returning to a place it had been away from long enough to leave a mark. Something in his chest did a thing he also did not name. He said, "I'm glad to hear that." And he was wholly and specifically glad in a way that had to do with her in particular, and not with the abstract satisfaction of a case well handled. "Your letter made a difference," she said. "I want you to know that. I wrote what was true," he said. "The bank made a sensible decision." She came to the counter and set her satchel on it, and they talked for a few minutes about the filing process, and then about the timeline for when the extension confirmation would arrive, and then about the cattle market because Jonas had a working knowledge of it and she had questions. And then the conversation moved in the way that certain conversations move when two people who think similarly find themselves briefly in the same place. It moved past the practical and into something less defined. He asked about the homestead and she described it, the house that Robert had built in the first year, the creek in the west section that ran well in spring and thin in summer, the kitchen garden that she had expanded every year until it was a real operation, the kitchen itself which she had improved steadily, because the kitchen was the room she spent the most time in, and a person should invest in the rooms they inhabit. She talked about Thomas and about her daughter Eliza, who was 9 and who had her father's stubbornness and her mother's eyes. She talked about these things matter-of-factly, without performance, the way someone talks about things they genuinely think about. Jonas listened with the full quality of attention that some people have and many do not. He asked questions that showed he'd been following closely. He did not offer advice she hadn't asked for. When she said something that made him think of something, he said so, and they followed it. She left 40 minutes after she'd come in, and the sun was lower in the sky, and she had not meant to stay that long and did not regret it. She thought about him on the ride home, the gray of his eyes and the quality of his listening, and the way he'd said "I wrote what was true" in a tone that suggested truth, was simply the standard he operated from without much drama about it. She thought about those things, and then she thought about Robert, who had been a good man and a decent husband and who had worked himself to death on Kansas soil at 37 years old, and grief moved through her cleanly like water, not the consuming kind but the acknowledging kind. She let it pass. Thomas was quiet beside her on the wagon seat. After a while he said, "Who did you go to see?" "The man at the land office," she said. "He's helping us with the farm." Thomas thought about this. "Is he a good man?" Georgia kept her eyes on the road. "I think he might be," she said. Thomas nodded as though this settled something for him and looked back at the horizon. The confirmation of the land extension arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks into November, by which time Georgia had sold the 2 steers at a price that covered the remaining balance on the note with $4 to spare. She went to the bank first and paid Harold Fitch his money and received a receipt and the satisfied feeling of a debt fully discharged. Then she went to the land office. It was a cold November day. The wind off the plains had teeth in it. She wore her heavy coat that had been Robert's before it was hers, the sleeves rolled up twice at the cuff, and her dark hair was pulled back, and she had her clear eyes fixed ahead, and she looked, if anyone had been observing from a sufficient distance, like someone moving with purpose through a world that had tried to stop her. Jonas saw her coming through the window before the bell rang. He was aware of the fact that he had been noticing when she came, in the 3 weeks since he'd seen her, which was one visit, and he had been noticing the absence of her too, which told him something he was in the process of deciding what to do with. She came in and said, "The note is paid." The way she said it, he understood immediately what that meant in terms of the 3 months behind it and the work it had cost and the sleepless calculations and the clenched jaw in the bank and the long rides in the cold. He understood all of that and responded to it with the fullness it deserved. "That's fine work," he said simply. "I have the confirmation letter," she said, and put it on the counter. "I wanted you to see it." He read it and looked up, and she was watching him with those clear eyes and a quality in her expression that was open in a way he had not seen from her before, not the practical directness she usually wore, but something beneath it, something that was allowing itself to be visible. He said, "Your instinct about the cattle was right, keeping the breeding stock. It'll be a lean winter," she said. "Most winters are out here." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to tell me honestly if it's not appropriate." He felt something settle in him, the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting for something without quite naming the wait. "Go ahead," he said. "There is a social at the church in town this Saturday. I haven't been to anything like that since Robert passed. I was thinking of going and I thought." She paused, not from uncertainty, from choosing her words carefully. "I thought that if you weren't otherwise engaged it might be a pleasant thing if you came too." Jonas looked at her for a moment. The stove in the corner ticked. Outside the window a wagon passed on the frozen street. "I would like that," he said, "very much." The church social was held in the fellowship hall attached to the First Methodist Church on Saturday evening, and it was the kind of event that a small frontier town organized to remind itself that it was a community, and not just a collection of people who happened to live near each other. There were long tables set with food brought by various households, roasted meats and potato dishes and corn bread, and 3 kinds of pie. There was a fiddle player named Emerson, who was old enough to know every song anyone could request, and young enough to play it fast when the room wanted dancing. The coal lamps were lit, and the room was warm, and it smelled of food and beeswax, and the particular kind of warmth that concentrated human bodies produce in cold weather. Georgia arrived with Thomas and Eliza, and Jonas arrived separately, and the moment he came in the door and she was across the room he felt the distance between them as something specific and directional. He made his way across the room with a hat in his hand, and she was talking with a neighbor woman named Hetty Combs when he approached, and she turned to see him, and the small shift in her expression was something only someone watching carefully would catch. He shook her hand because it was 1873, and that was what you did in a formal public setting. Her hand in his was dry and rough with the cracks, and he held it a half-second longer than strict formality required, and she did not pull it away. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, and the formality of the titles was almost amusing given that they both knew it. Eliza looked up at him with Robert's stubborn eyes and her mother's directness and said, "Are you the man from the land office?" "I am," Jonas said. "Mama says you helped us keep the farm." Jonas glanced at Georgia. "Your mother did that herself," he said. "I just showed her some maps." Eliza considered this with the serious evaluating expression of a 9-year-old who was not entirely convinced. Thomas, beside her, gave Jonas the assessing look of a 12-year-old male who had recently become the nominal man of a household and felt the weight of that seriously. Thomas said, "Do you know anything about cattle?" "Some," Jonas said. "We have breeding stock we're keeping through winter, 2 cows and 4 hens and a rooster. We lost one of the hens last week." "To what?" "We don't know." "Mama thinks it might have been a fox," Jonas said. "Foxes will find a weak point in the henhouse if there is one. Worth checking the lower boards before the real cold comes." Thomas nodded with the air of someone filing information away. Something in his posture settled very slightly. He said, "All right," and went to get a piece of corn bread, and the assessment was apparently concluded. Eliza stayed and watched Jonas with her evaluating eyes for another moment and then went after her brother. Georgia watched her children go and then looked at Jonas. "You passed," she said. "Did I?" "Thomas gave you the cattle question. It's how he tests people." "And Eliza?" Georgia smiled. "Eliza will tell me later what she thinks. She does her evaluation privately." They found seats together at one of the long tables and ate and talked, and around them the room moved with the particular warmth of a community that was genuinely, if imperfectly, glad to be together. Jonas learned things about Georgia that the land office had not shown him. He learned that she had come from Missouri, that her father had been a school teacher, and her mother had died when she was 13, that she had read every book she could get her hands on since she was old enough to read and still did, that she had opinions about things that went well beyond the farm, about the management of the territory, about the situation of the indigenous peoples being pushed from their lands, which she spoke about with a directness that surprised the man across the table from her, who had himself thought about these things and said less than he should have. What the government is doing with the tribes, she said, during a pause in conversation while someone nearby laughed loudly at something, is a wrong that will follow this country for a long time. I know that makes me unpopular at tables like this one. Jonas looked at her. It makes you right, he said. She looked at him steadily. You think so? I've processed enough land filings to know what used to be whose land and when it changed hands and how. There's nothing complicated about the conclusion if you're willing to look at it. She was quiet for a moment. Robert didn't see it that way, she said, not as a criticism but as information. A lot of men don't, Jonas said, also without judgment. You're different from what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She considered this honestly. A man who was good at his paperwork, she said. He laughed. It was a full, unprepared laugh, the kind that happens before a person can decide how to present it, and it transformed his face briefly into something younger and more open. Georgia looked at the laugh and felt something warm and specific move through her chest. She had not expected to feel anything like that. She had not planned for it. She received it without argument. After supper, Emerson struck up the fiddle and the room rearranged itself for dancing. Georgia did not dance that night. It was too soon for that. Too many people who remembered Robert and would watch, and she was not ready to give them a performance of her own moving forward. But she watched, and Jonas sat beside her, and their shoulders were close enough together that she was aware of the warmth of him. The solid, settled warmth of a man who was comfortable in his own presence. And they talked quietly through the fiddle and the dancing and the laughter. And by the time the evening ended and she gathered Thomas and Eliza and put on her heavy coat, she felt, for the first time in 3 months, genuinely like herself. He walked them to her wagon. The night was clear and cold, and the stars over Kansas in November were the kind that make you remember that the world is very large and very old, and that most of the things people worry about are temporary. He helped Eliza up into the wagon and shook Thomas's hand in the man-to-man way that Thomas accepted with quiet dignity. Then he turned to Georgia. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said. "So am I," she said. There was a moment between them that was not awkward but was aware. The awareness of two people who know something has begun without yet knowing what shape it will take. "I wonder," he said carefully, "if you would object to me coming out to the farm some Sunday to look at those lower boards on the henhouse." Georgia looked at him for just a moment with those clear eyes, and something in them was warm and lit, barely visible in the dark, but there. "I would not object to that," she said. She drove home under the vast Kansas stars with her children asleep against each other on the seat beside her. And she thought about gray eyes and laughter, and the feeling of a shoulder warm against hers, and the particular way it feels when a person sees you clearly and is not afraid of what they see. He came the following Sunday with a hammer and a bag of cut nails and a section of pine board he'd gotten from the lumber yard, and Thomas met him at the fence line with the eager proprietorial air of a boy who had been looking forward to this and would not entirely admit it. The henhouse was behind the main barn, a small structure that Georgia had built herself the previous spring when the old one had finally surrendered. It was a competent piece of construction, but Jonas found 2 places along the south face where the lower boards had begun to separate at the base, not wide enough yet for a fox to squeeze through, but getting there. He set Thomas to work holding the boards in place while he drove the nails and talked the boy through what he was doing and why. And Thomas listened with the focused, serious attention of someone who understood that this was real knowledge being transmitted. Georgia watched from the fence for a while and then went back to the kitchen because there was bread to bake, but she left the kitchen door open so she could hear the low voices of the man and her son in the yard, the sound of hammer on nail, occasionally Thomas asking a question and Jonas's patient answer. Eliza came and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her. "What?" Georgia said, without turning from the bread dough. "I like him," Eliza said. Georgia worked the dough for a moment. "Do you?" "He explains things," Eliza said. "Papa was good at things, but he didn't always explain them. He just did them." Georgia turned to look at her daughter, Eliza's face was 9 years old and very old at the same time in the way that children who have lost a parent sometimes are. "Your father was a good man," Georgia said. "I know," Eliza said simply. "But I like Mr. Rourke too." After the henhouse was secured, Georgia asked Jonas to stay for the midday meal, and he stayed, and they ate at the kitchen table, the four of them, bread and cured ham and the last of the summer pickles. And it was the most natural thing in the world and also something very new, the newness sitting alongside the naturalness without contradiction. He came back the next Sunday and the Sunday after that. On the third visit, Georgia walked with him out to the west section to see the creek land that was now part of the extended claim, and they walked through the dry grass with their breath making small clouds in the December air, and he looked at the land with the knowledgeable eye of a man who understood what he was looking at. "Good soil," he said, crouching to turn a handful of it in his fingers. "You could put in wheat on the east section of this. Spring wheat, if you can get the seed." "I've been thinking about diversifying away from cattle," she said. "Wheat is a different kind of work." "I know," she said. "But the price volatility on cattle is—" She made a gesture that said what she thought about the price volatility on cattle. "Fair assessment," he said, standing and brushing his hand on his trousers. They were standing close together in the way that people stand when they are walking and stop suddenly, closer than formal distance, and not yet intimate distance, but somewhere in that charged middle space. Georgia could see the specific gray of his eyes in the winter light, which was thin and pale and made everything very clear, as though the cold had burned off any remaining haze. "Jonas," she said, and the use of his first name was a decision, small and deliberate. He went very still the way certain men do when something important is happening and they are trying to receive it without interfering. "There is something I want to say directly," she said, "because I am not good at indirection and I don't believe in it." "All right," he said quietly. "I am a widow with 2 children and a farm and a very lean winter ahead of me. I am not a simple proposition." "No," he agreed. "And I am not certain of what I feel yet," she said. "I want to be honest about that. But I know that I look forward to Sundays, and I know that when you are not here there is a particular quality to the absence, and I know that I trust you, which is not something I give easily." Jonas looked at her for a long moment. The December wind moved through the dry grass around them, and the creek was frozen and still at their feet. "I'm not a simple proposition either," he said. "I've lived alone for 7 years, by choice and then by habit, and I've gotten set in my ways in some respects that I am aware of and probably in some that I am not." He paused. "I know that I think about you when you are not here. I know that your mind is one of the most interesting ones I have encountered in a very long time, and I know that I would like very much to keep coming on Sundays if you will have me." It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal. It was 2 honest people finding the edges of something new and describing what they found accurately, and it was enough. Georgia nodded once, a small clean nod. "Then keep coming on Sundays," she said. He did. Through December and into the new year of 1874, through the weeks when the snow came in earnest and the plains went white and flat, and the cold settled in with the implacable patience of a season that knows it will be obeyed. He came Sundays and sometimes on other days when business brought him toward that part of the county, always with a practical reason, and always with time after the practical reason was addressed to sit in the warm kitchen and drink coffee and talk. Georgia's kitchen became the center of something. She was a good cook and a better conversationalist, and the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was strong, and her children were there, doing their lessons or their chores, and the 4 of them together in that room developed the easy rhythms of people who have decided to be comfortable with each other. Thomas showed Jonas his mathematics lessons and Jonas helped him through the problems without doing them for him, and Eliza read to both of them from the novels Georgia ordered from a bookseller in Kansas City and demanded their full attention for it. Outside, the winter was hard. 2 of the neighboring farms lost cattle to the cold. Georgia's breeding stock survived because she and Thomas built a temporary shelter against the south wall of the barn and bedded it with straw, and she got up twice in the night during the worst week to check the temperature and add more bedding if needed. She did not tell Jonas about the twice-nightly checks until weeks later, and when she did, he looked at her with an expression that was something more than admiration, a complex and specific feeling that had her particular face at the center of it. On a Sunday in late January he came and found her in the barn with her arm inside one of the breeding cows, in a situation that was not pleasant and that required focus. And he came in quietly and asked what she needed, and she told him without embarrassment, and he helped her without drama, and the calf was born alive and strong, and they stood in the hay afterward with their breath fogging, and the new calf wobbling on its legs, and Georgia looked at Jonas with hay in her hair and something bright in her expression that was exhausted and triumphant together. "You're not what I expected either," he said, looking at her. "What did you expect?" She asked, echo of the earlier conversation at the church social. "I'm not sure," he said. "Someone who needed more help than you do." "Everyone needs help," she said. "The question is just what kind." He looked at her for a long moment in the barn, with the new calf making small sounds and the hay dust catching the lantern light between them. He said, "Georgia," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something I have been trying to find the right time for, and I have concluded there is no right time, so I am simply going to say it." She faced him directly, the way she faced everything. He said, "I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I don't say it to put any obligation on you or to rush anything. I say it because I believe you deserve to know where you stand with me, and I believe you are a person who would rather have the truth plain." The lantern between them swayed very slightly in the draft from the barn door. The calf made a sound. The cow shifted. Georgia looked at Jonas Rourke for what felt like a long time, and was probably 30 seconds, those clear eyes moving over his face with the full attending quality she brought to everything that mattered to her. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been resisting it for several weeks because it seemed complicated and because I was not sure I was ready, but I am done resisting it because it is true, and I do not see the value in fighting what is true." He reached across the small distance between them and took one of her cracked, work-worn hands in both of his, carefully, as though it was something valuable, which it was. He held it and looked at it for a moment and then looked up at her. "Your hands," he said quietly. "They're a mess," she said. "They're everything you've done," he said. "They're remarkable." She looked at him holding her hand and felt something open in her chest that had been clenched for a very long time, since before Robert's death, since the early hard years of the farm, since her mother died and her father became distant, and she had learned to be sufficient to herself, because no one else was going to fill that role. Something that had been clenched for a long time opened, and the feeling was surprisingly like relief. She turned her hand in his and held it back, interlacing her fingers with his rough ones, and said nothing more because there was nothing more needed. They were standing in the barn holding hands with a new calf between them and hay in both their hair, and this was them, exactly and completely them, and there was nothing false or performed or careful about it, which was perhaps the best thing about it. February moved through, and March came in with its tentative warmth, and the first suggestion of the spring that the plains do not guarantee but occasionally deliver on. Georgia and Jonas talked about the wheat she wanted to plant on the west section of the extended claim, and she had already written off for seed prices, and he brought survey information about drainage patterns that would affect where to plant first. They were in the kitchen one evening in March when Thomas asked, without looking up from his mathematics, "Are you going to marry my mother?" The kitchen went very quiet. Jonas looked at Georgia. Georgia looked at Jonas. Eliza, across the table from Thomas, had looked up from her book and was watching with eyes that were carefully neutral in the way of someone who has been wondering the same thing. Jonas said, "I would like to." He was looking at Georgia when he said it. "If she would have me." Georgia held his gaze. She was aware of Thomas's pencil having stopped moving, of Eliza barely breathing, of the fire in the stove and the smell of coffee, and the sound of the March wind outside. all the specific details of this moment that she was recording without meaning to. She said, "Thomas, what do you think?" Thomas put his pencil down and looked at Jonas with the serious 12-year-old eyes that had tested him at the church social with the cattle question in October. He looked at him for a moment. He said, "I think Papa would have liked him." Something moved across Georgia's face, quick and private and gone. She looked back at Jonas and said, "Yes, I will." They were married in April in the same Methodist church that had held the social where they had first sat beside each other. The same Emerson playing his fiddle. The room full of Hays City people who had known Georgia as Robert Dawson's wife, and were now seeing her as her own woman choosing her own direction. And the minister said the words. And Georgia in her blue dress with her cracked hands holding Jonas's steady ones said "I do" in a voice that carried to the back of the room without effort, because it was the voice of someone who meant it entirely. Thomas stood beside Jonas as witness because he had asked to, and it seemed right. Eliza threw dried flower petals with a seriousness that suggested she had been planning this specific contribution for weeks. Hetty Combs, who had been at the church social and had been watching the whole of this winter's worth of development with the interested benevolence of a longtime neighbor, said to another woman beside her in a whisper that was not entirely private, "Well, she came into town in October with nothing but cracked hands and trouble, and look at her now." Which was one way to describe it. Another way was this. A woman who had never stopped being herself had found a man who valued exactly that, and the world, for once, had arranged itself decently. The spring after the wedding was a season of genuine work and genuine pleasure in a proportion that suited both of them. Jonas had his work at the land office, which he kept, because it was important work and he was good at it, and Georgia had no intention of asking him to leave it. She had the farm, which was expanding in the ways she had planned. They worked alongside each other in the evenings and on weekends, and the partnership was not just a romantic one, but a practical one, each of them genuinely capable and each making the other more capable, which is a form of love that sustains itself over time in ways that pure feeling alone cannot. They planted spring wheat on the west section in April, she and Jonas and Thomas together, walking the new furrows in the fresh earth while Eliza kept a record of the seed rows in a small notebook, because she had decided record-keeping was her contribution and she was thorough about it. The wheat came in well. By June it was a real stand, green and promising in the creekside field, and Georgia stood at the edge of it on a June evening, with the last of the light going pink and gold over the western prairie, and felt the particular satisfaction of having made something grow in soil that had previously made nothing. Jonas came and stood beside her, and she leaned into him, just slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there looking at the field for a while without needing to say anything about it. A man named Silas Cray, who held the adjacent northern parcel, and who had not been pleased about the Dawson land extension claim, cutting off what he had considered potentially his water access from the creek, rode over one afternoon in May with a hard look and a harder tone, and told Georgia that he intended to contest the extension, filing on grounds of a prior access agreement that he claimed Robert had made with the previous claimant. Georgia listened to this with her arms folded and her eyes level. She said, "Put it in writing and file it with the land office." Silas Cray looked at her the way certain men look at women who do not perform deference, which was with a kind of frustrated bluster. "Now I'm not, look here, I don't want any trouble with you, Mrs. Dawson, but it's Mrs. Rourke," she said, "and neither do I want any trouble. If you have a legitimate legal claim, file it. That's what the process is for." Silas Cray rode away unsatisfied, and the next week he did file a contested notice, and Jonas handled it with the same care and thoroughness he applied to everything, pulled every relevant record, found the documentation of the previous claimant's abandonment and the formal notifications that had been required and completed. And the contest was formally dismissed by early June with a written determination that made clear Georgia's extension was solid and lawful, and not subject to challenge on the basis Cray had described. When Jonas told her, over the kitchen table with the dismissal papers in hand, she looked at them and then at him and said, "Thank you." He said, "I just looked at the records." "You always say that," she said. "Because it's always true," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, cracked and brown from the spring planting, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that for a moment in the kitchen with the sound of Thomas doing something in the barn and Eliza reading somewhere and the farm making its steady sounds around them. Summer on the farm was a full and vigorous season. The cattle were healthy. The wheat was moving toward harvest. The kitchen garden was producing abundantly, and Georgia had begun trading surplus vegetables with neighboring farms in an arrangement that was less formal than commerce and more reliable than charity, which was how the best frontier economies tended to work. She also delivered meals twice a week to an elderly widow named Ruth Haverson, whose farm was 3 miles north and whose family was in Ohio, and who received Georgia's covered dishes with a dignified gratitude that Georgia matched with a dignified matter-of-factness, neither of them making it more than it was, which was a person who had what someone else needed. Jonas watched Georgia move through the world with the wonder of someone who had been living alone long enough to have forgotten that the world could be inhabited this way. Not the wonder of surprise, exactly, but of recognition, like hearing music you knew when you were young and thought you'd forgotten. He was not a demonstrative man by nature. His feelings ran deep and somewhat private, and he expressed them in action more often than in words. But he told her he loved her regularly and specifically, not as a general statement but tied to particular moments. When she came in from the field with her hat pushed back on her head and mud on her boots, when she read to the children in the evening in her clear voice, when she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning working through the farm accounts with the focused precision she brought to numbers. He said it in those moments as though the specificity was important, as though he wanted her to know exactly what he loved, not a general romantic notion of her, but these particular specific things. She received this and returned it in kind, and the way they were with each other was not the loud public kind of love but the deep quiet kind, the kind that is built in shared mornings and hard seasons and honest conversation and trust tested and found solid. In August she told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning before the children were up, at the kitchen table with the coffee. She said it simply, "I am going to have a baby." He looked at her across the table and his face did something complicated and slow, like a sky moving from one weather to another. He said, "Are you all right? How do you feel?" "Tired," she said, "and well." He reached across and took her hand. Said, "Georgia," just her name in a voice that had everything in it that he was. She smiled at him with those clear eyes, and the smile was not the public kind and not the careful kind, but the completely unguarded kind, rare and luminous, the smile of someone who is entirely present. "Another person," she said, "for this table." "Yes," he said. Thomas and Eliza received the news with characteristic differences. Thomas said, "Oh," and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" And when Georgia said they did not know yet, said, "All right," in a tone suggesting he would wait and see before forming an opinion. Eliza asked 17 immediate questions and then announced that she had already thought of 3 names, all of which she would submit for consideration in writing. The pregnancy was Georgia's 3rd, and she knew the shape of it. She continued her work at the farm with the adjustments the season required, delegating what she could to Thomas, whose capacity was growing, and Jonas quietly rearranged his working schedule to be home earlier in the evenings without making a production of it, which was exactly the right way to handle it. The harvest in September was the best the farm had produced. The wheat came off the west section in quantities that Georgia had hoped for but not allowed herself to count on, and Jonas drove the wagon himself to the grain exchange in Hayes City, while Georgia tallied the records in Eliza's careful notebook. And the price was fair, not generous but fair, and the farm moved into the autumn of 1874 in a different position, than it had been in the autumn of 1873 in ways that were both financial and other. Georgia stood at the kitchen window on an October evening, exactly 1 year after she had first walked into the land office, and looked out at the farm in the last of the light and thought about where she had been and where she was. And the distance between the two was not only the wheat field and the paid note and the extended claim and the new child coming. It was also herself, the particular way she now inhabited her own life, not alone in the braced, enduring way, but accompanied in the deep, quiet way. Carrying the same clearness in her eyes, but carrying it now for reasons that were different. Jonas came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked out the window with her. 1 year, he said, 1 year. They stood looking at the farm together, the barn and the new animal shelter and the wheat stubble in the west section and the kitchen garden going brown and the creek line in the distance, all of it theirs, which word still had a freshness to it that Georgia thought she would not take for granted for a long time. "What were you expecting," he said, "when you walked into the land office that morning?" She thought about it honestly. "To save the farm," she said. "Nothing else." "And what did you find?" She turned from the window and looked at him. The lamplight in the kitchen behind them caught the edges of his face, and his gray eyes held hers with that full attending quality that she had first noticed across a counter, and had been receiving ever since with steadily increasing understanding of how unusual it was, how genuinely rare, a person who looked at you as though you were the thing most worth looking at. "More than I came for," she said. He bent and kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that is both gentle and completely certain, and she held onto the lapels of his coat with her cracked hands and felt the solid warmth of him and the specific rightness of being exactly here. Outside, the Kansas prairie stretched in every direction under a sky going purple and gold, and the stars beginning at the edges, old and vast and indifferent to human troubles but beautiful witness to human joys. And inside the light was warm and the children were making sounds in the next room, and the farm was quiet in the evening and everything was all right. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was gentler than the previous one, which felt like a gift. The plains were not required to give and gave anyway. The snow came reasonably, and the cold was cold but manageable, and the cattle were fat and the grain store was full. And the lamp burned warm in the evenings while Georgia grew larger and slower, and made adjustments to her daily work with the pragmatic patience of someone who has done this before and knows which battles to fight and which to save energy for. Jonas read to her in the evenings when her eyes were tired, from the same novels Eliza brought out, and from the newspapers that came from Kansas City, and from an agricultural almanac he had acquired which Georgia found genuinely interesting in ways that made him smile. He cooked more often than he had before, not out of obligation but out of attention, noticing when she was tired and simply producing a meal without making it a thing that needed acknowledgement, and she received this without false protest and with real gratitude. Thomas, 13 by that winter, had taken on a level of farm responsibility that was genuine and purposeful. He knew the animals and the equipment, and the layout of the field with the specific knowledge of someone who had been paying attention for years. Jonas had been teaching him land measurement and basic survey work, not with any particular plan, but because Thomas was interested and Jonas was naturally a teacher in that quiet, practical way of people who love what they know. One evening in January, Thomas showed Jonas a sketch he had made of the farm, a rough survey drawing showing the boundaries and the sections and the creek line, and where the fields were and what they contained, done from memory with surprising accuracy. Jonas studied it for a long time and then looked at Thomas. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "From watching you," Thomas said, "and from the survey maps in the land office, when I've been in with Mama." Jonas said, "This is good work." He said it in the direct, specific way he said things he meant. "Real good work." Thomas looked at his drawing and then at Jonas with a carefully neutral expression that was concealing something that might have been pride. "I was thinking," Thomas said slowly, I might want to do that kind of work someday. Survey work, that kind of thing. Jonas looked at him steadily. That's a respectable profession and a needed one, he said. There's a lot of land in this territory that still needs proper surveying, and there will be for a long time. Thomas nodded. Could you teach me more? Yes, Jonas said simply. If your mother agrees, I will. Georgia, who had been listening from the next room, said through the open doorway, she agrees. The baby came in March, on a Sunday morning, appropriately enough, when the sky was clearing after 2 days of overcast, and the first real warmth of the approaching spring was beginning to be felt. Georgia had the instinct of someone who had been through it before, and they had arranged for the midwife from town, a capable German woman named Mrs. Brower, to be fetched when the time came, and Thomas rode for her at first light while Jonas stayed in the house with Georgia, and did exactly what she asked him to do, which was to hold her hand when she wanted it and stay out of the way when she needed the space to do what needed doing. Mrs. Brower arrived and took charge with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 40 years, and by mid-morning it was done, and the sound that came from the bedroom was the particular thin announcing cry of a new person entering the world, insistent and offended and exactly right. Jonas was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands clasped and his elbows on his knees when Mrs. Brower opened the bedroom door and said, "A healthy boy, and your wife is well." He stood up, and the feeling that went through him was one of the larger ones he had experienced, and he let himself feel it fully, standing in the kitchen of the farm that had become his home with the March light coming through the window. He went in, and Georgia was sitting up and holding the baby, and she looked at him over the baby's head, and her eyes were clear and tired and exactly themselves, those eyes that had looked at him across a counter in October of the previous year, with the full attending quality of someone who saw things as they were. "Come and meet him," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms with the careful handoff of someone who knows how to do it, and Jonas held the small creature and looked down at him, and the small creature looked up with the unfocused, world-accusing expression of the very newly arrived. "He looks like he has opinions," Jonas said. Georgia laughed, which was unexpected given the morning she'd had, a real laugh that was also somewhat exhausted. "He does," she agreed. "I expect that's your influence." Jonas looked at her and said, "Thank you." She knew exactly what he was thanking her for. She said, "Thank you back." They named him Daniel, after no one in particular, and for no complicated reason except that they both liked it, and Eliza's 17 submitted options had not included it, and she accepted the final decision with the dignity of someone who had given the matter proper consideration and was gracious in defeat. Thomas, seeing the baby for the first time, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "He's very small." "He will get bigger," Georgia said. "I know," Thomas said. He stopped." Jonas, who understood what the stop contained, said, "He's lucky, having a brother like you to learn things from." Thomas looked at him, then looked back at the baby, reached out one careful finger, and let Daniel's impossibly small fist close around it. His face did something young and unguarded and bright. Spring brought the farm back to its full capacity of sound and activity. Eliza, who was 10 now and opinionated about everything, had taken it upon herself to teach Daniel things as soon as he was old enough to listen, which everyone agreed was ambitious, but no one discouraged because Eliza's projects tended to produce results. Thomas was already working the west section with Jonas on Sundays, learning the practical measurements and calculations of survey work, and between his farm responsibilities and this new apprenticeship, he had the focused, purposeful quality of someone who knows what they are moving toward. George's hands, that spring, were still cracked. They would probably always be cracked because the work did not stop, and the Kansas air did not become gentler in hands that do real work show it. But Jonas kept a tin of lanolin on the bedroom shelf, and every night before sleeping he would take her hands and work the lanolin into the cracks without ceremony, just quietly, and she would let him, and it was one of the small rituals that does not sound like much described and means everything experienced. In May, Georgia wrote a letter to Hetty Combs's daughter, who was in Missouri, and had written to her mother asking about the territory and whether there might be opportunity there for her husband who had agricultural experience. Georgia wrote a thorough and honest letter about what the land was and what it cost and what the work required, and about the specific parcel adjacent to the Haverson property that was unclaimed and worth looking at. She sent it with the suggestion that if they came to Hays City, the land office man was thorough and trustworthy and would show them the survey maps and explain their options. When Jonas saw the letter before she sent it, he said, "You're doing what I did for you." "I'm doing what should be done," she said. "When you know what someone else needs to know, you tell them." He looked at her with that full, attending expression. "Georgia Rourke," he said, "just that." She looked back at him with the clear eyes and the small, certain smile that was her best one, the one that was entirely unguarded. "Jonas Rourke," she returned. Hetty Combs's daughter and her husband arrived in July, and Georgia showed them the Haverson-adjacent parcel herself, walking the boundary lines with them on a hot summer afternoon, and they filed a homestead claim through the land office with Jonas handling the paperwork. And by fall they were breaking ground on a new farm. And on the day they broke ground, Georgia stood at the fence line watching and felt the particular satisfaction of a circle that had completed itself. The help given returned. The kindness flowing forward into new hands. The summer of 1875 was a good one. Not without difficulty, because the frontier was never without difficulty. A dry stretch in July that threatened the wheat and required every irrigation effort they could manage. A dispute over a fence line with the southern neighbor that Jonas mediated with the careful patience and record-pulling authority of the land office, and resolved in a way that both parties could live with if not entirely love. A sick calf that Thomas and Jonas nursed through 3 nights in the barn. The ordinary emergencies and recoveries of a working farm in Kansas. But the table in the kitchen had the weight of a full life at it. Thomas and Eliza and Daniel in his cradle and Jonas and Georgia. And the evenings were full of the sounds of people who were genuinely glad to be in the same room. The sound of someone reading, of mathematics being worked through, of a baby making the sounds babies make, of 2 adults talking with the easy specificity of people who have been through something real together and know each other in the full way. On an evening in September, Jonas came home from the land office with something in his expression that was contained but lit. The expression of someone holding news that is worth holding carefully before delivering. Georgia looked up from the account she was working on and read him with the accuracy of someone who has been paying attention to a person for long enough to know their expressions down to the small ones. "What is it?" she said. He sat down across from her and put an envelope on the table between them. "The Territory Surveyor's office in Topeka has been looking for someone to manage the Eastern District Survey Coordination. They reached out to me through the Land Commission." She looked at the envelope and then at him. "In Topeka?" "No," he said. "The position is based in Hays City. It would mean managing survey teams across the Eastern District from here. More responsibility and more pay than the land office position." He paused. "And I would be able to take on apprentices formally." She understood immediately what that last part meant. Thomas. The formal pathway that had been informal until now becoming real and structured. "Tell me what you think," she said. He said, "I think it's a good position and I think I could do it well. But I wanted to tell you about it with you here, at this table, before I made any decision about it, because it affects all of us, and because you are the better half of every decision I make." She looked at him for a long moment with those clear eyes that had first evaluated him across a counter 2 years ago and had been growing in their understanding of him since. "You should take it," she said. "You think so." "I know so," she said. "You are better than that land office. You always were, and Thomas will want to know." Jonas accepted the position in October. 2 years to the month from the morning Georgia had first walked into the land office with the deed in her satchel, and her cracked hands and her clear eyes. He continued to work from Hays City, coordinating the survey teams and their records and training the junior surveyors who came through the Eastern District. And Thomas, 15 by the following year, began a formal apprenticeship that had the trajectory of a real profession in front of it. The farm continued to grow in the quiet, incremental way of things that are well tended. A second wheat field on the eastern section. The cattle herd rebuilt to 12 strong animals by 1876. A new chicken coop, built properly this time, with Thomas and Jonas working together, and Thomas doing most of the measuring and Jonas mostly handing him things. Eliza, 12 and already the sharpest reader in any room she occupied, talked about going to the normal school in Abilene for teacher training when she was old enough. A plan that Georgia received with the particular combination of pride and loss that comes with watching a child grow toward their own horizon. Daniel learned to walk in the spring of 1876, in the kitchen, between Georgia's outstretched hands, and fell several times and got up each time with the stubborn, unimpressed determination of someone who has decided falling is simply part of the process. Jonas watched from the doorway with the look on his face that Georgia had learned meant he was feeling something deep and was receiving it fully. "He gets up every time," Thomas observed, watching his small brother with an expression that was older and quieter than his age should have produced. "He does," Georgia agreed. "I think that's you," Thomas said, looking at his mother. "That part of him." Georgia looked at her son, who was 15 and taller than her now and still had the serious, evaluating eyes he'd had at 12. She said, "He gets a great deal of what's good about him from Jonas, too." Thomas nodded, accepting this. "I know," he said simply. And there was in those two words a whole long winter of adjustment and growth, and the quiet expansion of a 12-year-old boy's world, to include a man he had tested with the cattle question and found solid. The autumn of 1876 was a golden one, the kind that Kansas produces occasionally as though to acknowledge what it has required of its people. The light that fall was amber and long, and the plains went yellow-brown in the specific beautiful way of harvested land well worked, and the farm under that light looked like something from a painting, not idealized but genuine, the particular beauty of a place that has been cared for. Georgia and Jonas sat on the porch of the farmhouse on an October evening in that amber light, Daniel asleep in Georgia's lap, and Thomas and Eliza somewhere in the barn concluding the evening chores, and the farm settling into its evening sounds around them. The stars were beginning at the east edge of the sky, the same vast Kansas stars that Georgia had driven home under 3 years ago with 2 sleeping children beside her after the church social. "I was thinking," Jonas said. Georgia looked at him. He was looking at the western horizon, where the last of the light was going down. His profile in the amber was the profile she knew now as well as she knew her own hands. "I was thinking about that morning," he said. "October morning, 3 years ago, you came in and I was on the floor." She smiled at the memory. "Chasing your inkwell." "Chasing my inkwell," he confirmed, and the corner of his mouth moved. "And you said take your time in that voice you have." "What voice?" "The voice that is patient but not waiting," he said. "There is a difference." She considered this. "I suppose there is." "I didn't know what was beginning," he said, "when that bell rang and you walked in. I had no idea." She looked at the same horizon he was looking at, the last strip of light going gold to pink to violet above the flat Kansas land. "Neither did I," she said. "I came for a deed transfer and a note consultation." "And you left with—" She looked at him. He looked back at her. Daniel stirred in her lap and settled again. "Everything that matters," she said. "I left with everything that matters." He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand, the cracked, familiar hand, the hand that knew this land and these animals and his face in the dark, and the weight of a new calf, and the pages of a ledger and the warmth of bread dough, and the shoulder of a child, and the barrel of a rifle set against a fence post just in case, and the ink of a letter written in November that changed the course of a bank negotiation, and everything that followed from it. He held that hand in his. She let him. She always let him. because she had learned by now that letting someone hold your hand when you are capable of holding your own is not weakness, but is in fact a very specific kind of courage. The courage to accept what is real and good and offered honestly. The stars came out fully over the Kansas plain, the same stars that had been there before the farms and would be there after, indifferent and magnificent, and the lamp in the kitchen window made a warm square of light in the dark, and inside that square were the shapes of children making their way toward bed, and outside on the porch were two people who had found each other in a narrow land office over a survey map, and had built from that small beginning something lasting and true. The night deepened and the coyotes called from somewhere out past the wheat fields, and the cattle were quiet and Daniel slept, and the farm was whole and Jonas and Georgia sat in the dark holding hands and did not need to say anything else because everything had already been said that needed saying, and what remained was simply this: the long quiet happiness of two people who have each other and know the value of what they have. They had come by it honestly. Through cracked hands and clear eyes, and a bell ringing over a door and $14 in filing fees, and 2 breeding cows, and a restructured note, and a letter written on land office letterhead, and a church social, and a hen house, and a lean winter, and a birth in March, and a wheat harvest, and 3 years of Sundays. Through loss and work and honesty, and the particular kind of love that does not ask to be simple because it has learned that the real thing is always beautifully more complicated and more worth it than that. The farm was quiet. The stars were out. They were home.